Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we're going to examine the European Middle Ages. And particularly, we're going to think about how the Middle Ages helped to chart the path to the emergence of the modern Western world. Now, one can see the Middle Ages is a very long period of time. Typically, the Middle Ages is dated from the 5th century to the 15th century. And the emergence of the modern world is usually associated with the 15th century to present, at least in the Western sense. Why those dates? The 5th century, this is usually chosen because this is the century in which Rome, the Western Roman Empire, collapsed. Officially dated typically as 476 CE or AD. And the 15th century because this is the year in 1453, typically among other important events, but when the city of Constantinople, which was the center of the Eastern Roman Empire, founded by Emperor Constantine during the 4th century, and of course the center of the Byzantine Empire, which is what the Eastern Roman Empire came to be known as. This is the year 1453, when Constantinople finally collapsed amid the onslaught of the Ottoman Turks. It had been the city of Constantinople in the Byzantine Empire had really suffered irreparable damage following conflicts with the Seljuk Turks, Islamic Turkish peoples pressing into, as you can see here, pressing into the Mideast and Near Asia, and also the effect of the Fourth Crusade, which occupied Constantinople, Western Europeans crusading into these regions here. The Fourth Crusade, of course, occupied Constantinople. There was a great deal of sort of animus and disdain by Western Europeans towards the Byzantine people, and they would occupy Constantinople for some 3 generations, and these led to irreparable harm to Constantinople and the Byzantine, and ultimately gave rise to its collapse. And that's typically associated along with events like the Black Death and the 100 Years' War as marking really the end of the Middle Ages. Oftentimes when we think about the Middle Ages, we think about the Dark Ages, and historians try to really encourage us to not think about this period of time as a dark age. A dark age implies, of course, that nothing of importance happened, that the world was not sort of moving towards the next era in any meaningful way, that there was no meaningful economic systems, no great technological advancements, that society was stagnant, and effectively nothing of meaning, significance to the future was occurring. Historians really try to push us away from thinking about the Middle Ages that way. Now, the Middle Ages is a long period of time, and there are some things that certainly lend credibility to seeing it as a dark age. In general, lifespan is very short. In England during the High Middle Ages, the average lifespan was 31 years. The Middle Ages, by the way, is broken up into kind of 3 eras: the Early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, in the Late Middle Ages. And the High Middle Ages is kind of the most robust time in European medieval history. This is the period of the knights and the castles and the most sort of developed level of Catholic authority, for example, in Europe, economic advancement, and general profitability in trade during the High Middle Ages. Even during that time period, the average lifespan in High Middle Age England was 31 years. Now, granted, that would be affected to a degree by high infant mortality rates, but nonetheless, people don't live a long time, and medicine is not advanced, to say the least. It's also an era when there is no freedom of thought or expression. There's continual warfare and persecutions, and depending on the time period of history that you look at, it could be more or less, and depending on the region that you're in, could be more or less. During the early Middle Ages, it was, for example, common practice for example, to pillage monasteries, even the very monasteries in the domains of warlords that they controlled, Christian monasteries, for purposes of raising money to pay soldiers and so forth. So there's continual warfare during this period of time. There's a lack of public education. Certainly, if you're a serf, so in the so-called feudal system, the peasants, often referred to as serfs, they weren't slaves. They couldn't be bought and sold per se, but they possessed really no freedoms in the way we think about them. They couldn't really even leave the land they worked on without the authorization of the lord who controlled the manor. So you have very little opportunity for any kind of advancement. If you are a peasant, really no opportunity for advancement within society. It's a rigid class structure, very limited education, and the overwhelming majority of individuals are illiterate. Likewise, of course, during periods, you also not only face continual warfare, you have raids from groups like the Vikings, for example, who we'll talk about in a moment. But we'll touch on some of this other stuff too. There's a lot of items that very much lend themselves to this idea that it's not a dark age. That actually, without the Middle Ages, you wouldn't have the emergence of modern Europe. That the emergence of modern Europe owed itself, to a large degree, to the Middle Ages. The first universities developed during the Middle Ages. Universities like Oxford University, the University of Bologna in Italy, the University of Paris, just to name a few. And granted, these weren't like universities today where ideally every individual has the hope and or opportunity to attend college or university. These were for only the aristocracy and their children, but nonetheless, this creates an infrastructure for the future. You have, during the High Middle Ages, a meaningful development in towns and cities, as you had the emergence of greater economic prosperity, following important innovations, farming innovations relating to the iron-tipped plow, to usage of field rotation, and the development of the manorial system, a manor with amongst it a small village of peasants who farmed the land for the manor, created during the High Middle Ages, a robust agricultural produce, which could then be used for trade into the greater Mediterranean region. And this resulted in economic growth, and such economic growth that it witnesses by the beginning of the High Middle Ages, which usually is dated around the mid-11th century. You see the development of the stone castles that we imagine in association with the Middle Ages. Before that, rulers, kings, warlords, if you will, they would have been building out of wood, but with the economic prosperity of trade, you start to see stone castles being built, cities grow, towns develop. Within the towns, guilds to control production, prices, and so forth. The first parliaments were established during the Middle Ages, particularly the English Parliament, established by Edward I, following about 100 years after the signing of the Magna Carta. And many of your economic and legal structures, even basic writing form, is associated with the Middle Ages. And many of the Roman texts that the people of the Renaissance believed that they were using to get back to antiquity, if you will, were actually preserved by the courts of King Charlemagne during the early Middle Ages, whose, even though he himself was not literate, his scholars that he called into his court, who transcribed and copied numerous documents, created a basic writing structure and copied and preserved numerous Roman documents. So during the Middle Ages, and certainly if you're in the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, for example, and you look back at the Middle Ages, you're going to look back at the late Middle Ages, you're going to see the Black Death, and it's going to look like a dark age. But when we look at it from the grand perspective of history, and we view the entire development, we realize that this epoch in history was actually setting really, really integral precedents for the emergence of the modern world. That without these, the modern world couldn't exist the way we understand. So let's think about the charting of the future of modern Europe a little bit. So first of all, charting the future of modern England, one of the most important Western European players, one of the most important in the emergence of the modern world. This is a photo that I took of a Norman ruin, castle ruin, in Ireland, the Rock of Dunamas in Ireland. This is a Norman castle. So who were the Normans? And we know, of course, Ireland is not England, obviously. But this castle was part of the emergence of a Norman empire, if you will. And the Normans actually influenced and controlled regions not only in the greater United Kingdom, but also in Ireland, and even in the Mediterranean, in places like southern Italy and Sicily, found settlements of the Normans. The Normans were originally the Vikings. And if I go back just a moment here, this is a tapestry, by the way. This is the Bayeux Tapestry. It is depicting the Norman conquest of England, which is associated with the Battle of Hastings in 1066, which is what the Bayeux Tapestry, which is on display typically in Bayeux, sometimes it's on tour, but in Bayeux, France, which is in Normandy, in the cathedral there. And this tapestry depicts the victory of William the Conqueror in the Battle of Hastings. So who were the Normans? The Normans were originally Vikings, or if you will, Danes. The Vikings they were highly effective seafarers, obviously, and they built ships that were capable of effective long-distance maritime navigation. The ships, too, could travel in shallow water, 3 to 4 feet. And this gave the Vikings, during a period of time, particularly in the 9th and 10th century, the Vikings a great military advantage, the advantage of surprise over many people. Vikings, during that period of time, were associated with raiding settlements throughout the Western world, and they could move into, and they weren't large armies, by the way, that they were using. They were maybe 24 people, and they would move in very swiftly in these boats that could go right up the river. And most of your rivers in Europe flow to the north, so they could easily access the wealth of towns and settlements in Europe, and they could hit by surprise and be gone before those facing them would have been able to react. And even places like Paris were besieged by the Vikings during the time of the Holy Roman Empire, during the time of Louis the Pious, who was the successor to Charlemagne, who died in 843. This is an example of a round tower. Also, I took this photo in Ireland, and this is representative of the type of threat the Vikings represented, because these were built primarily to take quick, fast refuge from the pillaging and plundering assaults, the quick, rapid attacks of the Vikings. This map conveys a lot, okay? Everything in green here shows you where the Vikings would have contacted. Everything in the other colors are actually Scandinavian, Dane, or Viking settlements. And here you see Norman settlements. Okay. So the Normans were originally Vikings, and they came and they settled down in northern France. In northern France, they were vassals, meaning subordinates of the French king in Paris. In 1066, of course, William the Conqueror would conquer England and effectively turn England into a Norman domain, building the Norman Empire. You see it extends into Ireland and ultimately even down here into southern Italy. The Normans were no longer the Vikings at this time period. When we think about world history, interconnections and the change that occurs from people, places, things, and coming together in the world, that's one of the things that world historians typically analyze when studying history. The Vikings are a perfect example of that, or the Normans, I should say, are the perfect example of that. Because the Normans settle here in northern France, in Normandy, and over generations, they cease to be Vikings, and instead they become Normans. They adopt Catholicism, they adopt many of the mannerisms and dress of the greater Frankish realm, of the greater French realm, and they are vassals, again, of the French king. This led to some really significant political developments. Following William the Conqueror, William of Normandy's victory at the Battle of Hastings, we see the long-term development of a new English language. It takes a long time for these things to develop, but as the Normans conquered southern England, William the Conqueror began divvying out the domains to other Norman leaders and figures. And this results in a fundamental transformation of England and very much creating modern England. A new English language is born not long after that event, less than 2 centuries. The Magna Carta was signed by King John, and the Magna Carta was a very, very early sort of document that portends the development of citizens' rights and limitations of the government. It's not something the king would have wanted to sign. He had a revolt in his hands during something called the Count's War, and they basically forced him to sign this. But effectively, King John accepted a limitation on the power of the king and the mutual rights of, shall we say, the citizens. Now, at this time period, citizens refers to a very small group of people, other lords, basically, not to all people, how we think about citizenship today. But this is a very important development because, of course, that development ultimately leads rise to the formation of Parliament, which, again, when it was initially formed, not a high group of people that were part of this body, but eventually this comes to be the basis during the modern world for mass democracy that is witnessed today in the Western world. The English Parliament was created by Edward I. And now the reason Edward I created this Parliament was to fund conflicts with, like, for example, Scotland at the time. And this castle here was built by Edward I. And interestingly, this is in Wales, in the United Kingdom. But Edward I, his real purpose with this was really to raise taxes as opposed to, democratic purposes. He needed a vehicle for raising taxes, and he would use Parliament to do that. But eventually, this creates the grounding for the emergence of mass democracy in the modern world. And without this step, it's difficult to imagine the emergence of modern democracy, at least not in the same way that we understand it today. This is where you can see the Magna Carta, which is located inside of this church. There's 3 original copies of it, but one is located in this church in Salisbury, which is in the southwest of the United Kingdom, and it's near Stonehenge. So if you ever go to visit Stonehenge, you're probably going to have to stay in Salisbury, or at least go through Salisbury, and it's a perfect opportunity to go visit this integral document, a document that really creates the groundwork for not only the limitation of the English monarchy, but the groundwork for the idea that subjects and citizens are owed certain rights within their society. All right, we'll pick up with the next part of this video here in just a moment.